Difficult Dialogues, Voices from the Valley. I'm Lynn Pasquerella, president of Mount Holyoke College. Difficult Dialogues is intended to bring to bear voices from the Valley on some of the most complex social, ethical, and legal issues of the day. Today we're going to be talking about end-of-life care, and I'm joined by Dr. Jeff Zesiger from Cooley Dickinson Hospital. He's a palliative care specialist. And Laurie Loisel, who is a reporter for the daily Hampshire Gazette. Thank you so much for joining us.
Sure.
Pleasure.
So, Laurie, let's start with you. You were involved in putting together the Dignity Project, which focused on end-of-life decision-making. What's the impetus for the project?
Okay, let's see. It goes back to, I think it started out with my father committed suicide, and he was 83, he was perfectly healthy, and he just didn't like what he saw ahead of him in terms of end-of-life issues, and he just decided it wasn't for him. He didn't want to go into a nursing home, he didn't want levels of care, he didn't want to lose his independence. And so I and my family made a decision to be public about that, and we wrote it in his obituary, and then I wrote a column that appeared in the Gazette about why my family chose to be public about it, and that sparked a conversation in our community, I think, about end-of-life issues. And eventually, I mean, that column got a lot of letters, and then we opened it up and we ran a series of, I want to say, like over 3 months, once a week. You had one about community people talking about their end-of-life thoughts, some experts like yourself, some just people who had been through it with their own parents, and just created this conversation that then led to me becoming friends with this woman from Northampton named Lee Hawkins, who was a very vibrant 89-year-old when I met her. And then she turned 90, and she made a decision that she didn't want certain things to happen. She didn't want to leave her home. She didn't want to go into a nursing home. And she and her family decided to do something called VSED, which is voluntary stopping eating and drinking. And I ended up doing a series of stories about her decision, and met Dr. Zesiger that way.
So, Jeff, talk about that decision-making process when you were working with Lee. What were the conversations like?
They were amazing. She, I think, is an inspiring person. She was clear in her thinking. Her family was behind her. At that point, 2 daughters were saying, "We'll do what you want, Mom." And she had been thinking about this for quite a while. She saw her ability to get around deteriorate, and very clear-headedly said, "I'm not depressed. I'm not trying to rush anything. I just feel like at some point I'm going to know it. It's too late. I won't be able to do enough to stay home, like you said, and I'll want to just stop." She was aware that Massachusetts had had the referendum that didn't pass about death with dignity, much like Oregon, Washington, and now 5 states in the country. And she said, well, my options are limited, but stopping eating and drinking. And she just looked me in the eye and said, "How hard is that?" And it was great. She just was so matter of fact. So as we talked, I just shared with her my short experience in it. Over a 10-year period, I'd only met one other person that had asked for it. And she was also 90 years old, and somebody whose body was just weak, but their mind was clear. So the 2 of them they could have been sisters. And they both wanted the same thing, control. They wanted to say, if my mouth is not too dry, and I assured her we could help moisten her mouth, would it be too long? Would it be too hard to do? And in most cases, that process takes about 2 weeks. People just get weaker, sleep more, and she said, "That's for me." I said, "Well, when?" She said, "Well, not right now." And she had a good sense of humor. We didn't know about her son and would he also support her, and he came on scene, and he did. He said, "Mom, I'm with you." In addition, she said, well, I'd like some help, and having hospice at home was going to be a big help for her and her family, just to make sure that they were well supported, that she wasn't uncomfortable. I noticed with the last person I dealt with that just staying in one position in bed, when you get weaker, you get achy, sore. That person didn't get nervous, but some people might. And to have the right medicines for comfort available. And that's how the whole thing started, her one request from me.
Talk a bit about the referendum that was held in Massachusetts around physician-assisted suicide. Why do you think that failed? Laurie?
I think maybe people have religious objections to it, and the community wasn't ready. I guess you might have a different opinion.
No, I would agree with that. I think it's a lot of fear. And even as I've come up through medicine, never do harm has always been very strong in what doctors should do, nurses, anyone in medicine. So the idea that you could give someone a prescription to help them end their life sounds antithetical to doing no harm. But as I've been in medicine 30 years now at least, and I broke 60 a year ago, I just see it differently, that if somebody's at a point in their life where the ability to enjoy your life is much, much smaller, and you're at a point where you feel that pretty soon it's not going to be enjoyable enough to live, at that point some choice should be afforded each person. Would I be comfortable giving a prescription to somebody had that law passed? I would be very uncomfortable. So it's not an easy thing, and I think in Oregon and other states where it's passed since 1997, the experience is building, but people don't rush into this, and people are very, very sure to make the right decisions as they look at somebody's request to get aid in dying. So I think the fear in Massachusetts really bubbled up, and religious fear was definitely some of it. But I think the country's moved forward in the last few years from just 3 states, now 5 states, Vermont to our north. It's, I think, something that's going to come out in Massachusetts again in the near future.
But I think it's important to keep in mind that this is what Lee and my father were facing is really different from what the people who would want this law or you qualify for this if it passed, which is that they have a terminal illness. I think there's another issue that our society has to grapple with, which is just the natural process of aging and how people want certain control, and people are so different. And I really feel like watching what happened with my father, and then I was at Lee's house every day for those 2 weeks, watching what happened with her, that there just needs to be more conversation about options. I just feel like what Lee did was the most natural thing I've ever seen. Just kind of a natural evolution. She was slowly stopping eating anyway, and then she just kind of continued it. And what my father did, I don't think was natural. He shot himself in the head. And I just feel like if people in their, as they're feeling that they're close to the end of their life, have more options, then there will be a better chance that people won't choose something that I think is brutal,
Yes.
Big difference.
Yeah.
So it is fear. In some of the ethical discussions around these issues, there are distinctions between people who are refusing life-sustaining treatment, as you point out, where that's always been protected under the law, but we haven't allowed for physician-assisted suicide or active euthanasia, the active taking of a person's life out of considerations of mercy. Some people perhaps would have been prevented from committing suicide had they had the option of physician-assisted suicide. They might never have used it, but it's that comfort that I won't have to suffer if at the end of life the burdens of treatment outweigh the benefits, or if I'm in a position where I'm not willing to live under these circumstances any longer. One of the challenges we see in our society is that people's wishes aren't being respected at the end of their lives. We're not very good at comfort care, and hospice referrals come too late in many instances to really deal with the pain management and the kind of psychosocial issues that need to be addressed. So how can we redress a culture that is reluctant to speak about death and dying as a fact of life?
I think it's really getting down to our communities. So a program like yours, I'm not sure how many people might see this, but it's got a multiplier effect. And if the whole country's starting to actually understand there may be a need for a death with dignity, hopefully the much larger group affected, not just a few hundreds or thousands of people, but millions of people that die every year, they should know that they have good support, and hospice is that support. Palliative care, when you're faced with a serious illness and you're not at the end of life, that should be afforded for everyone too. But we're just starting in medicine to get palliative care and all the other specialties to work together. And it takes a while. We don't have enough palliative specialists even. But we're trying to have the conversations. There's so many different ways to do it now, so it's very encouraging. The Conversation Project, Gunderson in Wisconsin has a wonderful program, Respecting Choices. So a lot of what we need to do is have conversations when somebody's first diagnosed with a serious illness.
Or getting old. I mean, and also, if you don't mind me saying this about your profession, it seems like there has to be a change in the way doctors view death, that it's not a failure on their part.
Indeed.
Right?
And it was drummed into our heads in training that it was a failure. Nobody ever really said it, but they said you should know all the right things to do and be there to fix it. And that's part of the problem. Why are people asking for this, wanting to die now? It's because life is different. At the end of life, it used to be you'd have a short illness and you die fairly quickly. A cancer, you might die in a few weeks. So people were used to that. A heart attack, you wouldn't survive it. A stroke, you wouldn't survive. Now we get people to survive with chronic illness for years or decades. And after doing that for a while with a limited life and what quality you might see in it, you could see that somebody might get weary. So the sweetness of life is being sucked out of people's life at the end of their life.
And I think what will help too is if families take on these conversations before they need to do it, if you know what I mean. Like Lee and her family talked about this when she was in her 50s. So it wasn't like this foreign idea. She said, I am not going to want to go to a nursing home. Now everybody might change, and I think early on you and I talked about Lee, and you said people sometimes say this and then they change their mind. She never did. She was really committed to this and very clear thinking, and she got the information she needed, and her daughters and son got the information they needed. And the hospice element of it really made their lives so much better. It was like they got, like I said, like it was like the cavalry came in when she got taken in by hospice, and the family could just be there to be her loving caretakers. It was really nice.
There was an op-ed in the New York Times recently about Diane Reams and her experience as a commentator for NPR, and her husband, who had Parkinson's, choosing the voluntary stopping of eating and drinking. And at the end of the commentary, it suggested that this was an undignified death, that it would be better to have been allowed to engage in physician-assisted suicide. Who gets to decide what constitutes a dignified death?
The person.
Okay.
Yeah, we agree on that. Absolutely. And it's not just the person, though. It's person and family, or person and friends, if somebody has any, because it affects everybody in that group. And I notice that people that pull together well, and hospice helps pulling families and people together, so everybody's on the same page. Step by step, they work towards dying, and it's not unnatural. It's part of our life, and can you do it with some grace and dignity and some comfort? And I think in most cases we can. Like, I would say 98% of times it really works very well.
I mean, I feel like the way Lee died was so dignified and so graceful and so loving. It was hours with her daughters talking, looking at pictures. You know, I think 2 days before she died, it was a beautiful day in early September. They took her out in a wheelchair in her yard, and they just sat in the sun. And, you know, it was really quality time.
What would have happened if one of the family members said, you're killing her, and this is a basic human need, and you have taken an oath to first do no harm? You mentioned the Hippocratic oath. The goals of medicine still include prolonging life. So How is that consistent with your profession?
Well, I think the goal of medicine isn't to prolong life as clearly as it used to be, and that was the enemy. Now I think the enemy is becoming life that doesn't have meaning or quality. So we'd have conversations, we'd have lots of them, and if somebody was very angry or upset, you know, they have to be heard, otherwise it only makes them worse, and then it destroys the whole peaceful way of coming to the end of your life. Ethics. You work in ethics quite a bit. We have an ethics committee at the hospital, and it's wonderful. People come together, and people from the community, people in medicine, and the family and the patient, if they're able to come, and they can just say, well, what are their worries? What are their angers?
Did you talk about Lee's case at the ethics committee?
We actually did. And we didn't have family there. We had it because staff was just questioning, what are we getting involved in? Is this good? Is this ethical? And there were people that had questions about it. But by the end, I'd say everybody came to a point of saying, well, I understand. I may not want it for myself or my family, but I understand. I don't think everyone in the room said, I think that's the right thing to do. But they were understanding that it was a true wish of this person, that people weren't angry at each other, there was no secondary gain, trying to get their mom's money or something. It was just her wish, and it was long-standing, and that helped everybody calm down. And I think that's what it's about.
Well, there was this good deal of consternation when President Obama had proposed reimbursement for end-of-life discussions for Medicare patients, and so Sarah Palin, Betsy McCaughey, others were very public in their condemnation of this, saying, you know, Sarah Palin said, no death panel is going to decide whether my child with Down syndrome or my elderly parents are worth the investment staying alive. How do we educate people about the kinds of conversations that take place? And then at the same time, how do we protect people who might be coerced into making a decision that they otherwise wouldn't if they weren't economically vulnerable or perhaps mentally incompetent?
That's a good question. I really think the more conversations about it, the better. And so, in other words, if you have a lot of people at the table, you know, I think there's not a chance that somebody's going to be coerced, because there's people like Lee had to, the Cooley Dickinson asked her to see a psychiatrist, so she did. She would have gone through a lot of hoops for this, and that was one of them. Her kids thought it wasn't necessary, but, you know, Lee said, sure, I'll talk to anybody who wants to talk to me. I mean, I know she's an unusual situation, an unusual person in that she was so willing to talk to anybody, but I guess I just feel like the antidote for what you're talking about is just more and more and more conversation about it.
And to be sensitive, if somebody at the end of the conversations says, I still disagree heartily and you can't do this, then you just go back to the person and say, here's our quandary, how do we want to handle this? And the answer may not be clear that moment. You may need to just have a cooling off period, get back to it, discuss again. What I know, though, is that life always gets to its end. And if it's not today with a certain approach, then a week later or several weeks later, the issue will come up again, and that same sick person will now have a new problem. And there are times that people will then say, were against somebody taking their life in any way, they'll say, oh, but mom's not enjoying their life. She's not right now. And I had somebody just recently say that this person had been on hospice several times and come off when they started to get a little better. But she had such advanced dementia, and her loved one said, well, you've got to keep doing things. You've got to feed her, nurture her. And it was her love that was speaking. But everybody saw that this person was suffering more and more, and we couldn't give her any quality to balance out some of the necessary pain that she had with arthritis and things. But when it was her day to die, that same loved one said, I'm glad it's her time. So I think people understand it. They fight it if they feel that somebody's pushing it on them. And that, I think, is what Sarah Palin was getting at. Don't push this down my throat. But I think we're not doing that. I think having these conversations in palliative care, hospice, geriatrics, regular offices, in our communities, that's where it's at. And if everybody's more comfortable saying, what do you want? And then really listening and saying, you know what you just asked for, here's how you'd have to do it. Here are the things you might have to put up with. Here's what your family might have to face. And if everybody's heard all that and they understand it, often things go through. I'd say almost always.
I just think it's all about choices. I mean, Lee had a party, an ice cream social, like the week before she died, where people from her church came. And one of the people who came was this man who was in his late 90s, who was a friend of hers, and they were sitting together holding hands. And he had just found out he had a recurrence of multiple myeloma, and he fired his doctor because his doctor wasn't going to be aggressive enough treating it. You know, okay, so, and they were friends. Lee didn't choose that; he did. So it's not about forcing anybody to do anything they don't want to do. It's about letting people make the choices they want to make. So.
And many times people feel they have to go on with more and more treatments. That's what you should do. You should prolong life. Or the doctor wants me to do it. I'm pleasing the doctor, I'm pleasing my family. So these conversations bring out, what do people really want? And if you're gentle, you don't pull it out of somebody, you just let it come up, then you all of a sudden say, oh, that's what you want? And why?
Yeah.
I'll support you.
You invested an enormous amount of time in Lee's care, and you spent a good deal of time with her talking about her wishes and making those transparent to everybody involved. The reality is that job satisfaction for physicians is at an all-time low. The suicide rate among physicians is skyrocketing. There are constraints, institutional and organizational structures, system of relative value units that prevent doctors from having meaningful conversations with their patients about end-of-life issues. How do we reverse that trend? And what can we do to ensure that patients do have the time necessary to make their wishes known from the minute they start a relationship with a healthcare team, and not when there's a crisis?
Well, we've seen many things, at least in my lifetime, change that I didn't think could change. The Berlin Wall, women's birthing movement, feminism. There's been so many wonderful things, and it's grassroots. People saying, this is not good enough for me, I want it to change. Doctors have a way of changing if they see somebody wants something different. Every day somebody's telling me, well, if you use this medicine, you'll have this wonderful benefit for your patient. Well, we adopt that pretty quickly, and we add that to our armamentarium. We can just as easily say, fixing is not the answer for everybody. Let's look at who doesn't need fixing, who doesn't want fixing, but they want to be comforted. If we can more clearly define that, teach the new doctors, help the old doctors kind of understand that, I think we can change this, and I think job satisfaction will go up. Right now, if you don't fix somebody, you feel like a failure. Or if somebody's telling you you're not doing the right thing, you feel like a failure. Or you're trying to do more things in a system where there's so many paperwork constraints and no, you can't get that scan, you feel frustrated. So I feel that all, but every time I walk in the room with somebody in the family, it all goes away. And you just get to talk to somebody and you hear a story by Lee. And you just go, this is why we do this. If you're stuck doing the paperwork and worried about every dollar, you're not going to be happy. If you get into the people again, and that's going back to the heart of medicine.
I think it's about a culture change too, which is about having the difficult conversations you're talking about. And when the Gazette ran this 3-part series about Lee, we got a lot of more feedback than we've ever had, I think, for anything we've done. Some of it was positive, but a lot of it was very negative, angry that we had done this, and people saying, it's not appropriate to talk about death on the front page of the paper. So there is still this taboo about talking about death. And also, I think a taboo, particularly talking about people choosing death. It's one thing if it happens in an accident, but somebody making that choice is hard for people. I don't really understand it, but I think the more we talk about it, the more the charge will be taken out of it.
And when you go into medicine, I didn't have any experience with death and dying. I just said, I want to be a doctor. That was interesting enough. They didn't teach me anything about it except, oh, when somebody's heart stops, you have to go in as a doctor and certify it. Well, that's kind of spooky because everybody's left the room and you walk into this dark room and, oh my gosh, I knew this woman earlier today, or this man. So you don't get any support in facing that. And if you had a loss and you do bond with patients, who do you talk to? So there hasn't been any good support, but I think that's changing. And I'm encouraged very much by some of the new doctors that have joined over at Cooley and other places in the country that I meet. And they're not just media savvy and tech savvy, but they're starting to get the idea of what medicine should be. So I get a good feeling out of this. And that's good because I want a good palliative care team when it's my turn to need it.
So you see a culture change in your profession?
I do.
Yeah.
And there's a turnover and some people are retiring, that's helping. But some people that are in it and have been in it for a while are going, oh, if only I approach this person this way, I could have that conversation, that difficult conversation. Because if you're not taught, you have to really want to do it and just sort of be able to do it. But nobody just knew how to do surgery. They were taught. We can have conversation, discussions, and classes, and there's a lot of work going on. Atul Gawande's working on it. A lot of people across the country are doing it because it's so very important.
I think apart from what happens in the corridors of hospitals and in the classrooms in medical schools, one of the most significant ways that we can change our culture is through the work that you're doing. The series of articles that you did were transformative for people in the community. The work that you're doing with the patients and the outreach you're doing as spokespersons will make an enormous difference in helping people preserve their autonomy at the end of life. So thank you so much for your contributions.
Sure.
Glad we can do it.